Well, good morning, brothers and sisters at Grace Bible Chapel. And just a reminder that this will be my last video for this week, and we'll start up again next Tuesday. Again, we're just going to finish off where we are, or maybe not finish off, but continue on where we are in the book of Genesis. And this is where we're going to move a little bit into chapter 3. We've talked about how the garden was this place of fellowship for mankind and God to fellowship together. It was the purpose of God creating the garden. The purpose of creating mankind was to express his goodness and to show his goodness to and his love to his creation, and again so that his creation would show love back in return. We see that with that fellowship and that love, there was a condition that God placed. They gave man a choice to believe God and to accept all the goodness that he has given to him, that he can see in front of them, or to choose to disobey. And that was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, this call to fidelity, this call to trust, this call to believe, faith and believe that what God said was true, and that what he said is good is true, and that what he said is bad is true. And so here we have the downfall. It's what we would call the fall of mankind. It's one of the more famous stories in the Bible. And there's a reason for that. So let's take a look at it. It's in Genesis chapter 3. We're going to look at starting at verse 1, halfway through the verse, because I want to talk about what the serpent, this figure that shows up, who is already in rebellion against God and is in opposition to God, and in many ways is in opposition to mankind as well. And so we're going to see what this serpent, this deceiver, comes and what he says. And we're going to look at the deception that he lays out before Eve, who we kind of skipped over that portion in chapter 2, where God makes a helper for Adam. It's not good for him to be alone. And so from Adam's side, he makes Eve. And we have Adam and Eve. And so the serpent approaches Eve, and this is what he says in Genesis chapter 3. He says, "And he said to the woman, did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" And so here we have the deception. And the reason we know that this figure, this serpent, is in opposition to God, we see it right away in the very first words that he expresses when he opens his mouth. He questions the honesty and the authority of God. Did God actually say? Did he actually say, "You shall not eat of the tree in the garden"? And Eve expresses the command that God gave to Adam, and who I'm sure she heard from Adam. And then the serpent says outright, "You will not surely die." In other words, God's lying. What God is saying, what you think God said, is not true. You're not going to die. In fact, God's keeping something from you. He says, if you eat it, then you're going to become like him. Your eyes are going to be opened, and you're going to know good and evil. Now, it's interesting that there's a half-truth in there, isn't there? And there's a big lie. The truth, or the half-truth that the serpent says, is that yes, their eyes would be opened. And yes, they would know good and evil. Now, at this point, they only knew good. They only knew God's goodness. But in there's the lie, right? God was actually protecting them from something. God was protecting them from the knowledge of good and evil. But he says, no, God's not protecting you. He's keeping you from something. You're not going to die. You're going to become like gods yourself. And this is a convincing argument to Eve. And, whether Adam's convinced of the argument or whether he just follows along, chooses openly himself, following along with Eve as she gives him the fruit, mankind falls. They disobey God. And we'll look at the result of that next week. But I want to touch on this really important point. That when it's not so much that we need to be aware of what the obvious lies are. It's often really easy to see the difference between the truth and an obvious lie. The harder thing is to discern between what is true and what is kind of true or half true. Part of the lie that Satan tells, that the serpent tells Eve, is a half truth. There's truth mingled in with it. It sounds true. It sounds appealing. And so often when we are confronted with false teaching, with things that, and we see that throughout the general umbrella of Christendom. There's a lot of teaching out there that's off, but there's something that sounds true about it. It's sprinkled in with half truths, but it's not the whole truth. And the reason that Eve was able to be deceived here, or at least the reason why so often we're deceived, is that we don't know God well enough. Or we have a tendency to believe the lie if we don't have if we don't have confidence in the one who's telling us the truth. If we don't have confidence in who God is. Like if Eve had a better understanding of how God never lies, that he is the definition of truth, then the red flag would have gone up right away when the serpent tells her, you're not going to die, in direct contradiction to what God said. And so for us, it just shows how important it is for us to dig into the Word of God, to be in fellowship with God in prayer, and to get to know him as best that we can, to grow in our fellowship with him, because the more we know him, the more we know his character, the more we know who he is, the easier it is to trust the words that he says. And of course we have to know the promises that he gives and the words that he says as well. So that's my challenge for you today, just even as we briefly look at what the serpent's lie, the serpent's deception is if we don't want to be deceived, if we don't want to be deceived by either the world's ideology, the worldview of the world, ideology of the televangelist preachers, or any kind of false teaching out there, whatever the latest book is at the Christian bookstore, which can sometimes be very dangerous as well, we need to be seekers of the truth and know that God is true and that God never lies. And so when we read something in the scriptures, we read a promise of God, that's a promise that we can take to the bank, because it comes from him. It comes from the one who is true. So that's my challenge to you this morning. God bless and have a good day.